Okay, thank you again for being here. My name is Kelly Young. I'm a legal counsel with the Justice Collaborative, and I am so excited to welcome you all back to the Justice Volunteers' second webinar in our Blueprint series. And to give some background, the Justice Collaborative's Blueprint for a Safer and More Just America is a comprehensive framework for national criminal justice reform and outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration crisis and provides actionable solutions to creating a fairer and more equitable justice system. And one of the key principles outlined in the Blueprint is to treat kids like kids. So on that topic, today our awesome panelists will discuss the extreme sentencing of children. Before I introduce them, I don't want to forget to thank you all, our Justice Volunteers, for the great work that you do. As an organization, a great deal of our focus is on the nearly 24 district attorney elections that's coming up in 2020, and the research will have all done and continue to do on the prosecuted directory, and calling and emailing your local prosecutors and showing up to events and demanding reform has been outstanding. So thank you so much. And towards the end of this, you'll hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can be more involved in our teams and juvenile justice reform. And so as our panelists start the discussion, if you have any questions at all, feel free to write them in the comment box along with your name and where you're from. And we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. And now for our esteemed panelists. Joining us, we have Brandy McNeil, legal counsel with the Justice Collaborative, Theo Shaw, who starting this fall will be a Prettyman Fellow at Georgetown Law Center, and he's also a former Genesis defendant. We also have Marcy Mistret, Chief Executive Officer for Campaign for Youth Justice, and Eric Alexander, Youth Justice Advocate with Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. So thank you all for being here and taking the time to join us this evening. And to start the conversation off, we're going to be hearing from Marcy, and she's going to sort of frame the issue and tell us why we should be thinking about juvenile justice reform and how the system kind of got to where it is now.
Thank you so much, Lee. It's great to be here. I guess I wanted to start out by talking about what an extreme sentence means. In the United States, we charge children in every single state as adults, some as young as 10 or 11 years old. So the adultification of young people in our criminal justice system is alive and well in the United States. And in addition to that, not only do we charge them as adults, but we often charge them for incredibly long periods of time, including to life without parole sentences. And Brandy's going to go a little bit more into the history of that particular extreme sentence. But just to set a context, the juvenile court is relatively new in the United States. We established our juvenile court at the turn of the 20th century, and by about the 1930s, every state had its own separate juvenile court from the adult criminal justice system. What that doesn't mean, however, is that young people were blocked from going into the adult system. As a matter of fact, many times young children, particularly children of color, were still placed in the adult criminal justice system, even when the systems were separated. And then the other thing that it didn't guarantee is that the juvenile justice system that recognized that young people were different and that they needed different interventions and rehabilitation and things to get them on track didn't always play out in practice, right? And so there was a lot of litigation that went on that challenged these punitive practices and the lack of due process the children received by being in a separate court. And this led to some legal protections in the 1960s and 70s. So we thought that we were making a turn for the better and actually creating a system that might respond to the unique needs of young people. And then we ran into a spike in overall crime. And in the 1990s, we really, as a country, fully embraced the idea of young people being able to face adult sentences. This led to a great expansion of transfer laws, lowering the age of transfer, making transfer automatic, application of mandatory minimums, application of extreme sentences to many children, including the death penalty. So as a result, we had more than 3,000 children under the age of 18 that were sentenced to die in prison. We had 200,000 young people a year under the age of 18 who were charged as adults. 10,000 children a night slept in adult facilities. And transfer and sentencing became the most racially disparate aspect of the system, with Black children receiving adult sentences 10 times longer than their white counterparts who were charged with the same crimes. This approach obviously was incredibly misguided, unfair, and did not improve public safety at all. Reform was desperately needed, and the U.S. became and remains one of the biggest outliers in the way that we treat our children. So I'm really glad to be here and sharing the space with all of you who can talk so much about how this history has played out in real life. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Marcy. And before we go on to Brandy, can you just talk quickly about what you mean when you say there's been a change in transfer and what that actually means?
Yes. So back in the 1990s, it used to be that judges were the one way that young people could get into the adult criminal justice system. So if a young person was charged with a serious crime, they still started their case in juvenile court. A judge would review the facts of the case, and if they felt that the crime was too severe or that the child was quote unquote unrehabilitatable, then they would transfer or waive those children up to the adult. Were every bit as discriminatory, but they sent up 2,000 children a year into the adult criminal justice system. And so you're comparing that now when we make it mandatory or leave that in the hands of prosecutors, and you're talking about tens of thousands of children. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And now, Brandy, can you talk a little bit about the context of extreme juvenile sentencing and how the Supreme Court has weighed on that?
Yeah, so I think Marcy predictably did a great job sort of getting me to the point where I'm going to start, which is she ended off sort of in the 90s, right, where there was this time where we have this image of children as being super predators, right? And so as a result of the influx in crime, but also the change in how children were treated, more and more children were sentenced, transferred to adult court. They were given life without parole sentences, the death penalty, et cetera. So that brings us sort of to the early 2000s. Roper versus Simmons was a case where Christopher Simmons was sentenced to death in 1993 when he was only 17. And so the question the Supreme Court was grappling with was, does executing children violate the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment? So by a close decision, a 5-4 decision, they decided that yes, it was cruel and unusual punishment. So that was back in 2005. That takes us to May 2010. We have Graham versus Florida. That's a case where a 16-year-old boy was convicted of an armed robbery. So no one died in this armed robbery, but even so, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And so the question there was to the Supreme Court, does imposing a life sentence on a juvenile convicted in a case where no one dies, does that violate the Eighth Amendment? Does that violate the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment? And again, the court said, yes, it does. So that takes us to June 2012. So previously, what we were dealing with a lot of was, can you get the death penalty? Can you receive life without parole when there's no homicide involved? And so when we get to Miller versus Alabama, the question then is, is a life without parole sentence of a 14 years old, if we can all just take a step back and remember who we were and the decisions we made when we were 14, I don't think any of us would want to be judged by the worst thing we ever did when we were 14 years old, let alone, now. But so in 2003, Evan Miller was convicted of, he was transferred to adult court, and then in 2004, he was found guilty and given a mandatory life imprisonment without parole. So the court then decided, again, a close decision, 5-4, that, children are substantially and constitutionally different from adults. I think that's something that we can all understand, just having been children ourselves. And that's something that the court sort of referenced. They said, children are fundamentally different. Ask any parent, ask any aunt or uncle. They are fundamentally different, and we cannot sentence them to life with no chance of getting out for something that they did when they're a child. And when they are fundamentally capable of changing, that's part of being a child, is a process of changing. And then, so the court, as I said, decided you can't sentence a child to life without parole. You do have to give them a meaningful opportunity to be released. And then what followed then in October of 2015, so not that long ago at all, Montgomery versus Louisiana, the great state of Louisiana, where I practiced for several years, is known for their harsh treatment of children, I must say. And Montgomery versus Louisiana came out of the state, and the question was, all right, so you've decided that life without parole is unconstitutional. Is that retroactive? And the Supreme Court decided that it was. Now, these are just the cases about extreme sentencing that I wanted to sort of bring everyone's attention to. But the fact of the matter is that all of this jurisprudence, all of this law is built off of cases that have been going on for a long time, talking about how kids are different. One case I can think of is North Carolina versus JDB. I always get the acronym, JDB versus North Carolina. And we're basically just talking about how that question was, can you question a child? Do you have to think about their age when you're deciding whether or not they can, waive their Miranda rights, whether or not they need somebody there with them? And so, and whether or not they feel like they're in custody. And so hopefully this movement that we've had towards looking at children as being children continues. But as you can see, I mean, we haven't eliminated the possibility of children doing 30, 40, 50 years for crimes that they've committed as children, as long as they have the chance at parole. So with that, thank you, Kelly, for and the other organizers for having me on.
Thank you, Brandy. And I actually have a follow-up question. So I know that, Miller says no mandatory life without parole, and then Montgomery makes that retroactive, but what happens next to the person who, after Montgomery, is resentenced to life without parole? Like, are there avenues for relief then? Are there things that are in the works with regard to those people who had that little ray of hope when Montgomery happened, but then ended up being resentenced to life without parole?
Yeah, so there is, as I said, I think, so that case came out in 2015. So it's still very much a work in progress. There are still people being resentenced pursuant to Montgomery versus Louisiana. So I don't have a ton of experience in the resentencing, so I can't give you an exact answer of whether or not, it's all over once they've been resentenced. I would like to think, and I sort of have to believe in being involved in this work, that it's never over, that there's always hope, that you can always keep fighting. And I think Montgomery versus Louisiana shows us that as the laws change, and hopefully as we as a society become more humane in our treatment of children, that, the Supreme Court will continue to hammer away at these laws that let kids be treated as adults and sent to prison for the rest of their lives. And that hopefully that will give people who've been sentenced under these laws a chance to be resentenced, and hopefully give them more and more chances.
Sure, thank you so much. And then next, because it's one thing to talk about the law and policies, but we want to know what that real life impact is. And so we have both Theo and Eric here, who, in addition to doing amazing legal work, have seen the other side of the system. And so we want to hear from them on the real life impact of extreme juvenile sentencing. And Theo, if you can get us started, that'd be great.
Thank you, Kelly. And like Brandy was saying, I'm actually currently in New Orleans, Louisiana. Brandy was, talking about being in a state that is notorious for its extreme treatment and sentencing of young people, particularly young Black males. Um, I was actually 17 years old in high school. I was a high school student, 17 years old in my senior year of high school. And I had about 8 days remaining in my high school career. Didn't really know what I wanted to get into after high school. Growing up in the South, I always tell people to be, raised in the South as a Black family is to be raised in the church. And so I was raised in the church, and I actually sung in the choir. I was really into music. So when I was, thinking about what my life looked like after high school, music was something that was on my mind, although I didn't really have a definite sort of idea of what it was that I wanted to get into after high school. But I did have that in my mind. But I had 8 days remaining in my high school career before I was, pretty much done with high school and just had to wait another month or so for graduation. There are a lot of racial tensions going around the small community of Gina, Louisiana, which is, rural Louisiana. There's only about 3,000 people in this small community. Is 85% white. And if you've ever been to Gina, I'm sure none of you have, except maybe Brandy. But if you've ever been to Gina, it's very clear how it's a very segregated community. White people live on one side of town, Black people live on the other side of town. And law enforcement, when I was growing up in Gina, was never afraid to stop me and my friends or any young Black males in that small town of Gila, Louisiana, ask us, what are you doing on this side of town? You need to, get back on your side of town. And we never really questioned it. We just saw it as a way of life or how things were supposed to be in Gina. But that sort of attitude started to change when I was in high school. And, some of the Black students, would, ask the, principal if it was okay if some of the Black students could sit under this tree that, was, known for where only white people hung out. And so there was this sort of, push against the status quo there in Gina. And sort of it just culminated into a whole bunch of racial tensions going on there in the community, a lot of which I have no personal knowledge about because I actually wasn't there, but just hearing about all of what was happening there in Gina. And I can remember one night being with my friends. We were actually at a friend's house earlier that day, just listening to songs on YouTube, and we were just singing these songs on YouTube. And we decided later that night to just go to the convenience store just to get a couple of snacks. Me and my friends, all of us were teenagers. We decided to just walk to the store and get some snacks. Well, when we got to the store, there was actually a white male who knew one of my friends who I was with. And I guess they didn't, have a friendly relationship because when this white, male, this grown white male saw me and my friends, he went to his truck and he pulled out a long shotgun. And I don't really know anything about guns, but it was, a long gun. And he, before he can turn around and, point it at me and my friends, one of the guys who I was with was able to wrestle it away from him. And we all ran home because we're thinking, if you have one gun, heck, he probably got another gun. So we all ran home, didn't think nothing else about it. And a couple of days later is when the big fight happened at Gina High School, where they said, these 6 Black males jumped this white student. I didn't actually know the student. And I don't think they really knew what happened there at Gina High School. But I ended up being arrested for something that I had completely no idea, no involvement in. And I can remember sitting in my English class my senior year with those 8 days remaining. And I can remember the police taking me down to the principal's office, didn't read me my Miranda rights. I didn't know about Miranda. Maybe if I knew Brandy, I had a lawyer at the time. Or maybe she knew a lawyer. But I can remember the police sitting me down in that principal's office, asking me all these questions about what happened at this convenience store, what happened here at the schoolyard fight. And when I finished answering all the questions he had for me, that's when he decided to read me my Miranda rights and tell me that I was under arrest. And he walked me out of that high school, Gina High School, which is the only high school they have in this small community. He walked me out of that high school. And to this day, I've never actually stepped foot back in that high school because when I finally got out of jail, pre-trial, I had to go to a whole nother state to finish high school because Gina wanted me to go to an alternative school. And I didn't really think alternative school would set me up to where I wanted to be in the future. But one of the, effects of having, as a young person, go through that system is just to be so blind to what was actually happening to myself as a young teenager in this system that oftentimes even adults can't maneuver. But here I am, a 17-year-old kid, locked down 24/7. There was no outside. I was locked down for 24 hours every single day for almost 8 months with adults who actually become friends with. I can remember around month 3 or 4 not having heard from my public defender. My family was poor, so the court appointed me a public defender who I only saw one time those 8 months I was incarcerated. And the one time I did see him was the time he was trying to convince me to take a plea. And I didn't understand why I had to take a plea if I didn't do anything. And at some point, I just decided I'm going to start writing my own pre-trial motions. And my bond was set at about $120,000. I was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, second degree battery, conspiracy to commit the second degree battery, as many charges as you can think of when it comes to this supposed attack on this student at the high school, something I didn't have anything to do with it. So they threw all these charges on me. I decided at one point I went to sleep with attempted murder charges, and when I woke up, I had some armed robbery charges. I thought to myself, I'm not going to sleep anymore because if I go back to sleep, maybe I'll have some more charges. But I sat in there for nearly 8 months, and I just started writing my own motions to the court. And they didn't grant any of them, but it's the fact that I was a young person, letting them know that I didn't think what they were doing to me was right. And that's sort of the statement I was trying to make to them. And as sort of when I got out of there, I spent 3 years before law school working with young people in the juvenile and criminal system, mostly here in Louisiana and also in Mississippi. And I always tell people, I spent hundreds of hours talking to hundreds of young people in facilities across Louisiana and Mississippi. And I honestly can say I never, met a young person who I thought deserved to be in that detention facility. And I've met young people who may have been involved in really bad situations, but I never just thought to myself, having spent so much time with them, that they deserved to be where they were. But sort of getting to know them showed me the many ways in which they too, in many ways, have been victims of their communities and victims of, a school system that didn't value and things of that nature.
Theo, thank you so much for sharing that. Eric, if you want to go ahead.
Yes. Well, I was a perpetrator in a crime as a juvenile. At the age of 17, I was with a childhood friend when I agreed to stand watch out as he went into a convenience store to steal beer. And so, to put you in a mindset of the type of crimes that, juveniles participate in. At the age of 17, I didn't foresee the outcome that, someone could possibly lose their life, during the participation of that crime. As a result, I had to plead guilty to 2 25-year sentences to avoid life without the possibility of parole because my defendant in that case, who was also 16 years old, actually took the life of a store clerk. This year marks 25 years that he is still incarcerated. I served 10 years inside of the Department of Tennessee, and I've been home now for 15 years. I'll share with you that being 17 and turning 18 inside of the adult prison system is horrific. In no way was I prepared to be in that environment. And because I was a perpetrator in the crime, I was placed in an environment where men there had already either gone to prison or they were facing life sentences themselves. And, I can tell you that the county jail situation for me and the children around me who had also turned 18 inside the juvenile justice system were the most brutal years of the 10 years that I served inside of the prison system. Luckily for me, when I made it to Tennessee Department of Corrections, I was able to finish high school, and there I began to study developmental psychology, where I began to work with other gang members inside of the system as we began to backtrack our way out of gang life. And we began to learn that trauma had actually put us in situations where we were committing the type of crimes that we were involved in. You have to understand that when youth grow up in environments where they are riddled with gang warfare, drugs, and violence, you are highly susceptible to those things. And I'm trying to hold back, the passion, for this, but I experienced things inside of the adult prison system that no child or no young person should ever have to experience. So, with that said, prison is in no way conducive to the type of growing and development that children need when they enter that system. And, once you're seen as an adult and, you're seen as someone who is worthy to be thrown away, that 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds' health and well-being is not even considered. You're just a number on the compound. So this is the real life impact of being sentenced as a child. Those who have experienced high volumes of trauma are susceptible to even more trauma. Children who are scarred upon the onset have the potential to be, scarred even more when they enter the system. So the adult prison system is not in no way a solution to children who commit violent offenses.
Thank you, Eric. And can you actually take us into the next section and talk about the work that you're doing now and the different legislative challenges and changing you're advocating for?
Yeah, so the work that I'm doing now, I am co-founder of ICANN, which is an acronym for the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. And ICANN is a group of men and women like myself, children who were sentenced into the adult prison system who are now home, making positive contributions to their community. Part of the work that we do is we share our narrative with, lawmakers and stakeholders, bringing them closer, bringing them proximate to the issue, so that they understand that this is not an issue that affects those across the tracks, that, this could happen to anyone. And, in doing so, this brings them closer to understanding that, each one has a role to play in, bringing our children home. I'll share with you that, one of the most astounding things that we're finding is that men and women who went into the prison system as early as 14, 15, and 16 years old are now coming home or are actually just being resentenced at 42, 43, sometimes 44 years later. A few months ago down in Louisiana, I was able to attend a parole hearing where a man who had served 61 years in prison since the age of 17 was finally granted parole. So this is the state of the country. This is what we're working against. And, I'll move you forward into recent jail WAP victories because, I don't want to harp on the bad. I want to celebrate the victories here as well. Oregon Governor Kate Brown signed legislation that would ban life without parole for juvenile offenders, and also remove the requirement that 15, 16, and 17-year-olds will be charged as adults for certain crimes. In D.C., Washington District of Columbia has also moved to pass the IRA Act, which is the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which allows judicial review and potential sentence modification after 15 years. West Virginia has what we consider to be the model legislation in the country, which offers parole review for children after serving 15 years. California has moved to pass comprehensive reforms in youth and young adult sentencing schemes as well. Washington State in 2018 banned JLWAP, and Arkansas passed the 539 Act in 2017 that abolished life without parole for children. But, we have work to do. Case in point, we have states like Oklahoma, Michigan, and need I say, the southern half of the country that really fought for, the Confederacy to exist. It remains the half of the country that holds on to these sentencing practices, and change needs to take place. Tennessee, leading the way, has no resentencing, no legislation passed, and an extremely severe life without parole sentence at 51 years, the highest in the country for children. Louisiana even though they passed legislation modifying their laws after Montgomery, they still continue to sentence children to jail WAP at an alarming rate. You also have Virginia refusing to re-sentence and passing no legislation. So, to date, 21 states and the District of Columbia has passed legislation ending jail WAP or no longer use the sentence. But I'm proud to say that out of those that have passed, we have 516 releases of those formerly serving jail WAP. So, again, on a high note, more than 1,900 people have been resentenced and are eligible for legislative relief. It's sad to say, but, for those who are coming home, it is a bright light. At resentencing, the average sentence before parole review is at 25 years. So those who were once told that they would die in prison are getting parole review.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for ending that on a high note. That's awesome. Marcy, do you want to go ahead and talk about what you're doing?
Thanks, Kelly. Similar to what Eric just went through, we also are trying to fight transfer at the front end. When I'm listening to Theo and Eric, what we try to do is to address the age of criminal responsibility. So what age kids are automatically considered adults. Theo talked about that in Louisiana. That no matter what the crime was, when you turn 17 years old, you're going to be placed into the adult system. They just raised the age. They did the first half of it this past year, and then in 2019, they'll do the second half of that, so that every child will now start in juvenile court in Louisiana. That said, I was just in New Orleans, and they are still incarcerating and detaining most of the kids who are charged as adults in the adult jail. And while they got a school started there, so I think that gives judges some opportunity to say they're doing the right thing. They were all men, they were all young Black men, and they were all shackled all day, even in their classrooms. And so some of the things that Eric and Theo talked about happening is still very much happening today. I am happy to say that in Raise the Age, when we opened about 12 years ago, there were 14 states who set that age below 18, and now we're down to 4 states, and Michigan has passed legislation that we just needs to be signed by the governor. In addition, some of the states that Eric talked about that had jail WAP successes also did end what we call mandatory transfer laws, which once again puts the decision back into the hands of juvenile court judges. We promote that. Rhode Island and Delaware. Rhode Island ended mandatory transfer. Florida this year, after a big fight, ended mandatory transfer. Delaware has rolled back. Illinois has rolled back. California actually last year passed the strongest law in the country, and now forbids any child under the age of 16 from being transferred at all, no matter what the crime. Usually there's what we call carve-outs. And I do want to point out here that while certainly the young people who are facing these horrific jail WAP sentences often are charged with homicide or accomplice, felony murder charges, that's not the biggest number of kids that are driven into the adult system, right? So I do want to point out that a 10-year sentence to a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old is still extreme, right? And so if you hold that barometer up, and then you're talking to what Eric's talking about as a review after 25 years, a resentence after 50 years, I mean, it's really, it boggles the mind, honestly, how we can consider ourselves humane at all when we're looking at children that way.
Thanks, Marcy. Theo, can you discuss your next steps with the Pretty Men Fellowship and what you plan to do after that?
Sure. While I did do a lot of juvenile justice work before law school, I graduated from law school last year, and I'm currently working for the Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court, and I'll be done next week. It's been a one-year fellowship, but in August 22nd, I'll be starting at Georgetown Law School as a Freedman Fellow with the Criminal Defense and Prisoner Advocacy Clinic. While part of the program is some sort of clinical supervision of law students, it's mostly the representation of poor people charged with crimes in the District of Columbia, and also doing some sort of prisoner advocacy work for people who are currently incarcerated.
Got it. Thank you, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Brandy, can you talk about what the Justice Collaborative is doing with regard to juvenile justice reform?
Absolutely. So, and I just wanted to sort of echo something that Marcy said about, so as I mentioned before, up until April, was a public defender in New Orleans, and I was mainly over in juvenile court. And so that often meant I represented kids facing transfer from juvenile court to adult court. And sort of in line with what Marcy was saying, I was still fighting it after I left into May, but there was one client of mine, a 15-year-old boy, who kept being transferred back and forth between the juvenile jail and the adult jail because they had overcrowding, because they were arresting a bunch of kids for like breaking into cars, and they had to keep them at the juvenile facility. So they transferred this kid back and forth. And it got to the point where he was just like, I'm tired of moving, just let them keep me in adult court. And that's the sort of the way the system beats these kids down from jump, right? Innocent or guilty, treating children like adults is wrong. It's not humane. It makes no sense. And it's for all those reasons that we at the Justice Collaborative have sort of four planks of what we're trying to do when it comes to juvenile justice. One of them is never treat a child or try a child under the age of 21 in adult court. I don't know if you know this, but your brains haven't fully formed until you're like 25. So let's treat people in a way that makes sense with how they've developed. Second is we are aiming to abolish juvenile life without parole sentences and de facto life sentences, currently and retroactively. So along the lines of what Marcy was saying, we don't just want to address the actual on paper it says life without parole. We want to deal with those long sentences that really don't account for the fact that people can change a ton, not only from childhood to adulthood, but into those 10, 20 years after they've been sentenced. There's a lot of change and development that can go on. Third is stop all criminal charges for school-based disciplinary behavior, so school to prison pipeline. And then fourth is close every youth prison in America, and a juvenile facility should be designed for growth and rehabilitation. And the way that we're going after these planks, and I think Kelly sort of got to it, is we are, as much as the presidential race obviously makes a difference, it matters, but when it comes to juvenile justice, when it comes to criminal justice generally, the district attorneys' races are some of the most important elections that are going to be happening in your community. And we at the Justice Collaborative are trying to bring more attention to that fact. We're trying to bring out into the light what is often kept in the dark, the fact that district attorneys are just automatically transferring juveniles to adult court. That's not something that anyone really realizes unless it's brought to light. And so we at the Justice Collaborative are working hard to kind of expose what sitting district attorneys' views are and what they're doing. And we're pushing for more progressive candidates, if nothing else, to push the conversation. The people who are running for district attorney should have to answer to the community about how they treat children and why it is that they are, or hopefully are not, transferring kids to adult court. So that's what we're doing. And I know that later Molly will talk a little bit about how you guys can help us achieve that goal.
Thank you for the segue, Brandy. That is actually what's going to happen right now. So Molly, go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brandy. Thank you to you and Marcy, Eric, and Theo, all our panelists, for sharing with us your time and your expertise and your experience. We're really lucky to hear from you on this really important issue that I think is top of mind for a lot of people that care about criminal justice reform more broadly. So Brandy talked a little bit about what we do at the Justice Collaborative in different ways. And as Kelly mentioned in the beginning, the Justice Volunteers is another project of the Justice Collaborative. So we at Justice Volunteers do a few different things. One thing that's sort of the bulk of what we do right now is to do research on issues across the blueprint, including all of the planks that Brandy mentioned under treat kids like kids, which is a really important part of our blueprint. So we do a lot of research across those issues and many more, and I'll focus in on that a little bit in just a moment. But we do some other things too. We use social media and other avenues to amplify really important stories about the issues that are sort of range all of the things we cover in the blueprint and then beyond as well. And we've, since our last webinar, actually have launched an action team, which is involved in research and involved in media amplification, but goes beyond that to do things like actually contacting elected representatives in the criminal justice system to see change on a policy level, to learn from things like this webinar series that we have and other educational materials, and then share that information with their communities. We can let you know if you're on the action team about things that are actually happening where you live. So there's other ways to get involved in a more in-person way. So we're really excited about launching that and hope that many of you will join. So just to hone in a little bit on a research project we actually have right now that's related to the things that Theo, Eric, Marcy, and Brandy have just touched on, is how media, which really has such a heavy hand in guiding how we think about a lot of these issues, covers juvenile justice issues. And then we, on this particular research project, are focusing in on actually the coverage of school arrests. So the project that we have that we'd really love for you to jump in on as soon as tomorrow is to pick a state. We have a set of instructions that are really specific, and then a spreadsheet similar to a lot of the research projects that we do, where you'll fill in information. You would take on a state or a part of a state and do research on how media in that area, local media, is covering school arrests. So the goal of this project is sort of twofold. One is to understand better how local media are covering these things and how that relates to our perceptions of what's going on in those areas. And then the other is actually to use that coverage to get a better sense of the number of school arrests that are happening, which is really related to the extreme sentencing that we focused on today. So thank you again to all of you for being here. For those of you that are not already plugged into one of the three teams I mentioned, our action team, media amplification team, or research team, we really hope you'll do so. We need your help to move the needle on some of these really important issues. So we have a cool feature here in Zoom where we'll actually, for those of you joining us by computer, are gonna launch a quick poll. So you should see that right up on your screen. And you'll see 3 questions. So if you could just right now fill that out, it will just take a second and we'll give you a moment to do that. The first question is, are you able to help with this juvenile justice research assignment? That's the coverage of school arrests across the US that I mentioned. The second is, are you interested in joining us, in joining our justice volunteer teams and all of the things that we do? And if so, if you just check the box of anything you're most interested in, or all of them, which we hope you do, that would be great. And then the third one is actually an important question that's gonna help us frame the future webinars that we do. So if we have here the sort of overarching things that guide the blueprint that Kelly mentioned earlier, stop making poverty into a crime, treat kids like kids, allow people to grow and change, treat addiction like the medical issue it is, end cycles of violence and unnecessary family separation, and make people in their communities stronger. So we'd really love to get your feedback so that the next time we are being sure to address something that's sort of most interest to you. So please make sure to fill out that poll, and thank you so much again for being here. I'm gonna hand it back over to Kelly for our question and answer session for the rest of the time that we have.
Thanks, Molly. So the first question is one that I'm going to give back to Brandy, just because you mentioned while you were talking about brain development and how that doesn't fully happen until we're 25. And so one of the questions was, what are the biggest barriers to getting scientists involved in the conversation and having this ultimately be a field of study?
So I think that we have made tremendous strides in how brain science is used. Obviously, it's something that's, when it comes to seeing how the brain develops, is something that's difficult to study and research. But advocates are, a big thing is making sure that advocates are armed with that information to be able to use it in an intelligent way, right? So I still include myself as a public defender. We need to bring more attention to this when we're in a courtroom, reminding judges, reminding prosecutors, this person is a child, their brain hasn't finished developing. They are, by their very nature, impulsive. It's what they do. They make split-second decisions, and this shouldn't change the entire course of the rest of their lives. I also think that in the media, we need to be paying more attention to how it is that brains, and not just brains, I think it's just reminding people that, like, this often dark-skinned child that you see on the news who's done something horrific is basically biologically the same as your 13 or 14-year-old kid that's with you. They just may have had a different life that has led them to that place, but fundamentally they are still a child. They are still someone who, you know, is sneaking out at night and making poor decisions. It doesn't mean that that should impact the rest of their life. And I think also the media needs to do a better job of using that science to show that that we shouldn't be looking at kids as adults just because of whatever the crime is that they've allegedly committed.
Thanks. And this next one is for all of you or whoever wants to take it. So what are some strategies either you guys have used or you think can be used for engaging officials who are so enmeshed in this corrupt system, for getting them to understand what the actual issue is with juvenile justice?
I will take a first shot at that, and I'll be brief in my remarks. I think they should be made proximate to those who were impacted by the very laws that they are imposing, or they are in a position to change. When they get a chance to sit in front of a child who's been sentenced into the adult prison system and hear that child's life, hear the traumatic experiences that that child had, and also how trauma further impacted that child's life while in prison. I think they are then in a position to fully understand the issue and move to make some type of change.
I would agree with that, Eric, and I also think we got to remember that very few people in the justice system actually go to the places where they're sentencing these children to. That's including DAs and judges. When we train nationally and ask folks about how many of them have been to the youth units where they're sending these young people, most of them have never been. So Families Against Mandatory Minimums has a visit a prison campaign going on right now. So I would say get people, to Eric's point, proximate, and let them see where they're sending children, because once you're in an adult prison, it's pretty clear that there's not a lot of rehabilitation going on.
Okay, awesome. And this one is actually for all of you. So if you had to pick the single biggest issue in youth justice, which one would you point to? Brandy, start us off.
Oh man, I'm sitting here like there are so many issues. I mean, I think that as a society, part of our problem is that we don't want to spend money until the back end when we could spend money and put resources on the front end. So I think the thing that would make the biggest difference in criminal justice is if we made sure that everyone had a safe place to sleep every night, every child had something to eat every night, every child had a school to go to that didn't just pass them along to the next grade, but made sure that they could read, made sure that they could write, made sure that they could go to a technical school if they wanted to. So I guess my point is that I think as a society, we need to stop looking at and punishing behavior on the back end, when what we should be doing is encouraging and developing positive behavior on the front end, so that we don't have this juvenile crime issue that we, in Louisiana, in New Orleans, there's a new crime wave that's happening. But the reality is, when you have decimated, first of all, it's a lie. The statistics they're using are wrong. But when you decimate mental health services, when you take away all the summer programs or make it really, really difficult to get into them, or summer jobs, like, you can't be surprised when kids are roaming around, like, doing things they shouldn't be doing. So I guess I sort of think we need to put our money outside of juvenile justice system and into the education and mental health and all of those other systems.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I think one thing I'll add, just having, as I said earlier, I spent, hundreds of hours talking with, hundreds of young people, both in the juvenile justice system and also children who are being charged as adults, children as young as 14, 15, 16 years old, mostly here in New Orleans, but also in North Louisiana, and also in Biloxi, Mississippi. And one thing that always stuck out to me was the quality of legal representation that young people receive once they were in the system. I totally agree. If it was up to me, I would have young people in the system. I would, subject youth to these long sentences. But dealing with the problem that we have today, I would, I find it necessary to address the quality of the legal representation, specifically the lack of resources that is put forward to representing young people in the criminal justice system. I know it's, one thing dealing with adults, and in a lot of ways, we see adults being able to sometimes represent themselves, but you have young people and they don't know what these legal terms mean. They don't have, adequate resources, the attorneys don't, to really investigate and to see what's going on in a child's life. That brought them to that particular moment, and there isn't that level of resources. There aren't adequate resources for the attorneys, or even enough attorneys to give young people the quality of representation they should receive. I also spent some time in North Louisiana, where we were investigating the right to post-conviction, post-disposition counsel for young people in Louisiana, where young people were supposed to, have this opportunity after they were adjudicated delinquent or whatever, to come back to the court to say, look, Judge, I've completed this program, I haven't had any disciplinary problems. But one thing we found out is that young people weren't receiving post-disposition counsel once they were adjudicated. And so that was something that really stuck out to me at the time, and I think still a problem, especially across the South today, where the quality of representation oftentimes is so bad that young people feel it's lost, throughout the entire process.
And I would say, in the practice of sentencing children as adults, because children make decisions that cause harm or, other negative consequences, that doesn't make them automatically adults.
And then I would really say tackling the racism that's inherent in the system. I mean, to me, what is alarmingly clear is that when we're going to all of these facilities and fighting to change these laws, it is mostly Black and brown children. And, with the crimmigration issues going on now, we're seeing facilities get more per bed dollars to take unaccompanied minors that are crossing the border. And so you get this whole crimmigration thing hitting criminal justice, where we might be able to close a youth prison for youth misbehavior, but then we reopen it for immigration. We got to tackle this and just abolish the whole thing, really.
And one thing I would just add on to that, having, thinking about as we, see the documentary today about the exonerated 5 to Central Park 5. I don't think there's ever an instance where subjecting a young person to solitary confinement is ever appropriate, regardless of whatever that young person was involved in that facility. I don't think that's a punishment that is ever necessary for young people.
Thank you all so much. So I think we're going to end there. And I know there were a ton more questions and that this is a huge issue. And because of that, we'll be having 2 additional juvenile justice webinars in October, which is Youth Justice Awareness Month. And those will be focused more specifically on the criminalization of youthful behavior, the role poverty plays, and the school to prison pipeline. And so all the questions you guys have will hopefully be answered there. So stay tuned for that and also for next month's webinar. And so before you go, we would love to get your feedback. And so there's a poll up now asking you to rate the webinar and how likely you are to join us in the future. And so while you're doing that, Theo, Marcy, Eric, and Brandy, thank you all so much for taking the time to talk with us, share your experiences, good and terrible, from engaging with this system. It's amazing, and I hope we will partner together in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
For having us on, Kelly.
Perfect. And to our justice volunteers, as always, thank you for all of the great work that you do.
Yes.
Have a good night.